أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So today's check-ins are: how do you feel? And when do you feel this way? And why? Okay, so we'll go ahead and move inshallah to this riddle. So normally I don't give you a hint, but I give you a hint here. But anyways, the scenario goes like this. Someone reaches out to you and mentions some traumatic experiences in the past, especially in their past, especially in their childhood. This person has feelings of overwhelm, hopelessness, worthlessness, overall depression, and anxiety. This person also has many health conditions that are not helping mentally and emotionally. This person would like your help in making sense of all of this and to manage these conditions. Managing means kind of living with them, but not necessarily curing them. But it'd be even better if they can get them cured, essentially. So at least how they can manage. What could be going on, and how would you proceed, assuming that you have the time and capacity to help? Like, let's say that you are willing to help and so on, and you wanted to help, and now you're trying to figure out how to do it. So what would you do? What's going on, and how would you proceed? Now again, this is the time you just kind of understand the whole scenario, and then we're going to watch some stuff, inshallah, and discuss some things, and then after that we'll come back, so you have enough time, because I'm priming you with certain things, so that when you actually are listening to those things, you're discussing those things, then the answers are going to be something that your brain is going to pick up more readily, inshallah. Just take a look at this for the next 10 seconds, and then we'll move forward, inshallah. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move, inshallah, to the next thing. And this is just again review, so keep in mind how transformation works. Step 0 was making sure that you know the capital T truths, so that you're understanding the reality of things. Step 1 is the envision. Step 2 is to figure out the current inventory, where you're standing. And we said for smaller goals, when you're not looking at the bigger life stuff, but incremental stuff like the mile markers and so on, in that case you're going to figure out where you're at first, and then you're going to figure out where you can reasonably get to, right? Looking at your capital T truths. But in the long run, capital T truths, being the first step, kind of accounts for that. And then breaking it down into chunks, and then breaking it down to daily plans and stuff, so you can get those chunks achieved, those mile markers. Every mile marker going from one to the next, those are going to be incremental stuff. So those are going to be going from one mile marker to the next one would be by understanding the daily strategy, like the smaller steps and stuff that you're taking towards it, not just the checkpoints, but also the individual steps you're taking, and how to make sure that you're staying motivated and so on. And again, that's integrated and personalized. Okay, and then also making sure that transformation is sustainable, having the growth mindset that you can do it consistently and moving forward, and you don't just stop at a certain point. Then these are the things to keep in mind. What are the 3 components of motivation? Understanding what discipline is, meaning constantly aligning yourself. So sister, when she was mentioning about her her mind shift, and eventually confessing and accepting reality, right? So that's the discipline aspect. Now you constantly evaluate things, what's working, what's not working, and you accept what needs to be accepted, and you change your mindset accordingly. And then some things that become obstacles in transformation, some things that can become deterrents to your motivation and so on, are these things over here. And then we talked about, again over here, unrealistic expectations that came up today, right? Misconnections and kind of like mismatching something that doesn't need to go together. And so that's could cause confusion and so on, or kind of having unrealistic expectation as a consequence as well. And not having a purpose or something being meaningless, that can also make things very difficult, because we're not going to be able to sustain things because things are not meaningful and we're just doing it because we're doing them. Okay, and these are things that we can always look at in terms of breaking them down to the steps that we looked at before. Here, the transformation process, or just kind of like the goal settings and so on. So we can look at some of these things, or anything else that you would like to study, or that you want to break down in personal life or professional life or whatever. So with that, we're at the brain games. So today I limited it to 2, so we can go with them, inshallah. Now, I did try to kind of do like a spin-off of another name that you might have known from like one of the books that was written. Something ominous comes this way, but that's not the title of this talk at all, in the real title. But I just wanted to kind of like give you something to kind of think about, like this, while you're watching this video right here. And then over here, this right here is obviously not the meaning, the actual title of this, but I put it there just for something to think about, so you guys can kind of figure out which one you want to pick first. Wait, I have a trivia question. Does anybody know what I did this off of?
Something wicked this way comes?
Yes.
I was gonna request the YouTube video.
Okay. That was supposed to be this way came. I don't know why I put it this way. This way. That's how it's supposed to be. Something ominous this way came. Yeah. Okay. The YouTube video.
I believe somebody could be.
If, in rush hour traffic, you can remain perfectly calm, if you can see your neighbors travel to fantastic places without a twinge of jealousy, if you can love everyone around you unconditionally, and if you can always find contentment just where you are, then you're probably a dog, right? We hold ourselves to these unrealistic standards of perfection, and then we judge ourselves when we don't live up to them. The thing is, we're not supposed to be perfect. Perfection isn't possible.
So that's the definition of perfection, where you don't have flaws. Obviously, that wouldn't be the definition that you would apply for a human being, because by inherently, human beings are designed to make their own decisions, which can be wrong and right and so on. So just keep that in mind, the definition that she's using in this context.
But transformation is. All of us have the capacity to change, to learn, and to grow, no matter what our circumstances. As a professor and scientist, I study how people change, how people transform. And one of the most effective vehicles I've found is mindfulness. My own journey into mindfulness was unexpected. When I was 17, I had spinal fusion surgery, a metal rod put in my spine. I went from a healthy, active teenager to lying in a hospital bed, unable to walk. And during the many months of rehabilitation, I tried to figure out how to live in this body that could no longer do what it used to. The physical pain was difficult, but worse was the fear and the loneliness, and I simply didn't have the tools to cope. So I began searching for something that could help, and eventually this search led me to a monastery in Thailand for my first meditation retreat. At the monastery, the monks didn't speak much English, and I didn't speak any Thai, but I understood mindfulness had something to do with paying attention in the present moment. My only instruction was to feel the breath going in and out of my nose. So I began. 1 breath, 2 breaths. My mind wandered off. I brought it back. 1 breath, 2 breaths. It wandered again, sucked into the past or lost in the future. And no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't stay present. Now, this was frustrating because I thought meditation was supposed to feel like this, and instead, it felt more like this. Right? Being present isn't so easy. In fact, check it out for yourself. I've been speaking for about 3 minutes. Have you noticed your mind has wandered? All of our minds wander. Research from Harvard shows the mind wanders on average 47% of the time. 47%. That's almost half of our lives that we're missing, that we're not here. So part of mindfulness is simply learning to train the mind in how to be here, where we already are. Like right now, let's practice together. Allow your eyes to close and just feel your feet on the floor. Wiggle your toes and sense your whole body sitting here, softening the face, softening the jaw, and notice that you're breathing, feeling the breath as it naturally flows in and out of the body, just being here. And as you're ready, taking a deeper breath in and out, allowing your eyes to open. So, back at the monastery, I was trying hard to do just this, to just be present. But no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept wandering off. And at this point, I really started to judge myself. What is wrong with you? You're terrible at this. Why are you even here? You're a fake. And then not only was I judging myself, I started judging everyone, even the monks. Why are they just sitting here? Shouldn't they be doing something? Thankfully, a monk from London arrived who spoke English. And as I shared with him my struggles, he looked at me and said, "Oh dear, you're not practicing mindfulness. You're practicing judgment, impatience, frustration." And then he said 5 words that have never left me. What you practice grows stronger. What you practice grows stronger. We know this now with neuro.
The next part is really important. What you practice grows stronger. So think about what practices, what habits you've been doing that became reinforced because of the frequency, because of the constant reinforcement of practicing over and over again. Practice over here could be just repetition, doing it again and again.
Plasticity. Our repeated experiences shape our brain. We can actually sculpt and strengthen our synaptic connections based on repeated practice. For example, in the famous study of London taxi drivers, the visual spatial mapping part of the brain is bigger, stronger. They've been practicing navigating the 25,000 streets of London all day long. When you look at the brains of meditators, the areas related to attention, learning, compassion grow bigger and stronger. It's called cortical thickening, the growth of new neurons in response to repeated practice. What we practice grows stronger. The monk explained to me that if I was meditating with judgment, I was just growing judgment. Meditating with frustration, I'm growing frustration. He helped me understand that mindfulness isn't just about paying attention. It's about how we pay attention, with kindness. He said it's like these loving arms that welcome everything, even the messy, imperfect parts of ourselves. He also pointed out that we're practicing all the time, moment by moment, not just when we're meditating, but in every moment. We're growing something in every moment. So the question really becomes, what do you want to grow? What do you want to practice? When I left Thailand, I wanted to keep practicing mindfulness, and I wanted to understand it scientifically. So I began a PhD program, eventually became a professor, and I've spent the past 20 years investigating the effects of mindfulness across a wide range of populations, including veterans with PTSD, patients with insomnia, women with breast cancer, stressed out college students, high-level business executives. And over, the data showed 2 key things. First, mindfulness works. It's good for you. It strengthens our immune functioning, it decreases stress, decreases cortisol, helps us sleep better. When we published our first research back in '98, there were only a handful of studies. Now there are thousands of studies showing the beneficial effects of mindfulness. It's good for us. The second thing we learned was quite unexpected. Almost all the people we were working with, regardless of their age, their gender, their background, were talking about the same thing. This underlying sense of, I'm not good enough, I'm not okay, I'm not living this life right. This tremendous self-judgment and shame. And we all know what they were talking about, because shame is universal. All of us feel it. And worse, we have this mistaken belief that if we shame ourselves, if we beat ourselves up, we'll somehow improve. And yet, shame doesn't work. Shame never works. It can't work. Literally, physiologically, it can't work, because when we feel shame, the centers of the brain that have to do with growth and learning shut down. This fMRI shows the brain on shame. What happens is the amygdala triggers a cascade of norepinephrine and cortisol to flood our system, shutting down the learning centers and shuttling our resources to survival pathways. Shame literally robs the brain of the energy it needs to do the work of changing. And worse, when we feel shame, we want to avoid it. So we hide from those parts of ourselves we're ashamed of, the parts that most need our attention. It's just too painful to look at them. So what's the alternative? Kind attention. First, kindness gives us the courage to look at those parts of ourselves we don't want to see. And second, kindness bathes us with dopamine, turning on the learning centers of the brain and giving us the resources we need to change. True and lasting transformation requires kind attention. And the monk's words echoed in my ears. Mindfulness isn't just about attention, it's about kind attention. This attitude of kindness wasn't just a footnote or something nice to have, it was an essential part of the practice. A part of mindfulness that's so often overlooked. So my colleagues and I developed a model of mindfulness that explicitly includes our attitude and our intention, as well as our attention. All three parts working together synergistically. Put simply, mindfulness is intentionally paying attention with kindness. We used this model while working at the Veterans Hospital for a group of men with PTSD. I was shocked to learn that we lose more veterans to suicide each year than to combat. Our soldiers carry so much pain and shame. So the intention of the mindfulness group was to cultivate this kind attention, even for the seemingly unforgivable parts of ourselves. There was one man in the group who never said a word, never looked up. 2 months passed, he seemed unreachable. And then one day he raised his hand and he said, I don't want to get better. What I saw in the war, what I did, I don't deserve to get better. He then looked down at the floor and proceeded to tell us in great detail what he had seen and what he had done. And I can still feel the horror of what he shared and how his shame filled the room. I looked up to see how the other men were responding, and there was no judgment, only compassion on their faces. I invited him to look up and to witness this compassion and this kindness. And as he slowly looked around the room, his face began to soften. And in his eyes, there was hope. The possibility that he wasn't just his past actions, that he could choose differently now, that he could change. And this may be one of the most important things I've learned. It's that transformation is possible for all of us, no matter what. And it requires kind attention, not shame. And this kind attention takes practice. It takes lots of practice. I want to share with you a simple practice that continues to help me. Some years ago, I was going through a difficult divorce, and I'd wake up every morning with this pit of shame in my stomach. My meditation teacher suggested an explicit practice of kind attention. She said, how about saying, I love you, Shauna, every day? I thought to myself, no way. It felt so contrived. She saw my hesitation and suggested, how about just saying good morning, Shauna? Oh, and try putting your hand on your heart when you say it. It releases oxytocin. It's good for you, you know. She knew the science would win me over. So the next day, put my hand on my heart, took a breath, and said, good morning, Shauna. And it was kind of nice. I continued to practice, and a month later when I saw her, I admitted how helpful it had been. Wonderful, you've graduated, she said. Now, the advanced practice. Good morning, Shauna. So the next day, put my hand on my heart, anchored myself, and said, good morning, I love you, Shauna. I felt nothing, except maybe a little ridiculous, but definitely not love. But I kept practicing because, as we know, what we practice grows stronger. And then one day I put my hand on my heart, took a breath. Good morning, I love you, Shauna. And I felt it. I felt my grandmother's love. I felt my mother's love. I felt my own self-love. And I wish I could tell you that every day since then has been this bubble of self-love and I've never felt shame or judgment again. And that's not true. But what is true is this pathway of kind attention has been established, and it's growing stronger every day. So I want to invite you tomorrow to put your hand on your heart and say good morning. And if you're really brave, good morning. I love you. Thank you.
Okay, so you guys can comment on this and present your thoughts and whatever it is that you would like to present, inshallah. I was saying if there's anything that you would like to discuss, or if you had any feedback or anything like that on this video, we can do that now, and then we can move to the next video, inshallah.
Oh yeah, I have a question. I was always like not sure what the Islamic perspective is on stuff like meditation and things like that. I don't know. I don't want to like, what's the word? It sounds too like I don't have a good adjective, but I've just personally never done it, and I don't know if I can get myself to get into that realm of stuff. I was just curious what the Islamic perspective is on things like meditation, mindfulness, etc.
Okay, that's a good question. There's a difference between yoga and things like that and meditation, where the meditation is just like it's a very generic word, essentially, right? Obviously there's different formats, different types, and so on. So for us, for example, part of that could be khushu', like when you're connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you're present in the moment as you're doing it. Like for example, the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ mentioned about ihsan, when Jibreel alayhi salam came and asked him about Islam, Iman, and ihsan. And another narration, it was Iman first, and then Islam, and then ihsan. And then, so in this case, ihsan, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه, that you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you could see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But even if you don't see him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees you, right? So you're present in the moment. You're reciting the Quran, for example, as if you are experiencing it, or you're really focused on the meaning, and it's taking you into deep thought and so on. So this is sort of like where you're kind of getting really relaxed. And we talked about Bilal, and the Prophet mentioned to him to kind of comfort us with the prayer. And so in this case, it's the similar concept where you get connected in a way where you're not really thinking about like whatever happened and stuff, or what's going on outside of the prayer and so on. There's another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ was talking to the Sahaba about saying Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, and so on. Um, and he mentioned in this particular hadith, he mentioned 10, 10, 10 after every prayer. So that's 30 times 5 prayers. That's 150. And then he also mentioned before you go to bed, you say Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, and you say Allahu Akbar 34 times. So in this case, that becomes a total of 100. And then you multiply that by 10, because every good deed that you do gets multiplied by 10. That's 1,000. So in any case, that's a total of 2,500. So in the case, the Prophet ﷺ described about how a person usually forgets it or doesn't get to do these things, even though they're such easy good deeds and stuff, right? And when he mentioned about prayer, when the Sahaba asked him, right? So he said about prayer, when you're praying, right when you're about to finish praying, the shaitan might come to you and kind of whisper to you and distract you about things that you need to do still, or you might have to go and do next and so on. So as a consequence, you're not going to actually remember to do it. So when you're actually mindful in the sense that you are in the moment, you're living in the moment, right? That's what mindfulness is. Kind of being aware of what you're thinking, why you're thinking it, what you need to think about, and so on, in the moment itself, and so on. So when you're doing this and you're focused on what you need to do, in the moment, then at the end of the salah, you're going to be more mindful, so that you're going to be remembering that, okay, I need to make my adhkar and so on. I'm not going to walk away until I finish doing that and stuff. So you're present in the moment itself. You're not thinking 10 steps ahead. You're not thinking 10 steps behind you. You're thinking about what you're doing at the moment itself. So that would be mindfulness. So if you're doing something like that, then in that case, that's Islam then, right? But if you're talking about something different, like for example, going to yoga classes and stuff and other things like that, then that's a different discussion. I hope that made sense over here. So there are different ways to be mindful. And more importantly, the most important thing here is that whatever you're doing, you should be present in the moment. Every step that you take, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching everything that you're doing, every step that you're taking, every thought that you have, every word that you might speak, for example, all of that stuff is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of as it's happening, right? So as you're aware of this, you're not doing anything except that you're thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ talks about that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, so this hadith Qudsi, that man adali waliyan faqad adhantuhu bil harb. Whoever shows enmity to my believing servant, or in this case, man adali waliyan, whoever shows any enmity to my close, to my wali is like, in this case, it's like referring to somebody that's really close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then it's like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is declaring war on that person. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about how a person gets close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you don't get any, like the person is never going to get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except, or the best way that a person can get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is through the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mandated upon the person. And the person will continue doing good deeds, hatta hubba, until I love him. This is like, extra good deeds like nawafil. He's not going to stop doing these nawafil until I love him. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in this hadith Qudsi, right, that when I love him, then I become the hearing with which he hears, and then he mentions about like the hand and like the walking and so on, and the eyes with which he sees and so on, right? So there's like four things Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in here. So in this case, the scholars, when they were discussing the meaning of this, they mentioned that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when I become the hearing with which he hears, right? Then this is saying that this person does everything. This person ends up doing all of those things that are pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning he only listens to those things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with, right? That's what it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes the person's hearing, that he focuses on things and says, should I do this, should I not do this, based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants, or what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with, and so on. And so he only listens to those things, he only sees those things, he only holds those things or touches those things or whatever, and he only goes to those places where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would like and stuff, and that's it. So the idea here is that you're being extremely mindful of everything that you're doing. In another way to describe this then would be taqwa, like having this taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything that you're doing, you're mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this could be something like, in English they try to translate this, and one of the ways that they say it, is God consciousness, being aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all the time, right? So this is also something that you can bring into this concept over here. So mindfulness can have different, I guess, manifestations, but ultimately the idea is to be present and kind of be aware what you're doing, why you're doing it, and doing it deliberately, and not just because, you know, just randomly somebody else is doing it and you're just kind of tagging along or whatever, but you're choosing everything, you're kind of focusing on everything, you're appreciating everything in the moment and so on, and that's what you're doing. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you something, then you are grateful to that opportunity, and so you're countering the shaitan's thing where he wanted us not to be grateful, and he said, وَلَا تَجِدُ أَكْثَرَهُمْ شَاكِرِينَ, you're going to find most of them not going to be grateful to you. So in this case, when you're actually focused on whatever you have and so on, and kind of focusing on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and so on, then that makes you constantly content, I guess, right? And that's what we were talking about earlier with the ayah, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا تَطْمَئِنُّ قُلُوبُهُم بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ, that the hearts find the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes the hearts content and satisfied and so on. And there's other verses on this too, that there are people who, when they're standing, قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ, that they constantly remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is where they find tuma'nina, and this ultimate level of satisfaction and contentment. And there's other stuff too, but I hope this answered this question. Allahu A'lam. Okay, so the next one is this video right here. I believe the first one was also a TED Talk. I don't remember. I think it was. Let's see really quick.
Our world today,
Yeah, it was a TED Talk.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities, access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand better than we ever have before how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior, and that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, it is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do. So in San Francisco, we created the Center for Youth Wellness to prevent, screen, and heal the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress. We started simply with routine screening of every one of our kids at their regular physical, because I know that if my patient has an ACE score of 4, she's 2.5 times as likely to develop hepatitis or COPD. She's 4.5 times as likely to become depressed, and she's 12 times as likely to attempt to take her own life as my patient with 0 ACEs. I know that when she's in my exam room. For our patients who do screen positive, we have a multidisciplinary treatment team that works to reduce the dose of adversity and treat symptoms using best practices, including home visits, care coordination, mental health care, nutrition, holistic interventions, and yes, medication when necessary. But we also educate parents about the impact of ACEs and toxic stress the same way you would for covering electrical outlets or lead poisoning. And we tailor the care of our asthmatics and our diabetics in a way that recognizes that they may need more aggressive treatment given the changes to their hormonal and immune systems. So the other thing that happens when you understand this science is that you want to shout it from the rooftops, because this isn't just an issue for kids in Bayview. I figured the minute that everybody else heard about this, it would be routine screening, multidisciplinary treatment teams, and it would be a race to the most effective clinical treatment protocols. Yeah, that did not happen. And that was a huge learning for me. What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies. Because when we have the right framework, when we recognize this to be a public health crisis, then we can begin to use the right toolkit to come up with solutions. From tobacco to lead poisoning to HIV/AIDS, the United States actually has quite a strong track record with addressing public health problems. But replicating those successes with ACEs and toxic stress is going to take determination and commitment. And when I look at what our nation's response has been so far, I wonder, why haven't we taken this more seriously? You know, at first, I thought that we marginalized the issue because it doesn't apply to us, right? That's an issue for those kids in those neighborhoods, which is weird because the data doesn't bear that out. The original ACEs study was done in a population that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. But then, the more I talk to folks, I'm beginning to think that maybe I had it completely backwards. If I were to ask how many people in this room with a family member who suffered from mental illness, I bet a few hands would go up. And then if I were to ask how many folks had a parent who maybe drank too much, or who really believed that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, I bet a few more hands would go up. Even in this room, this is an issue that touches many of us. And I'm beginning to believe that we marginalize the issue because it does apply to us. Maybe it's easier to see in other zip codes because we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick. Fortunately, scientific advances and frankly, economic realities make that option less viable every day. The science is clear. Early adversity dramatically affects health across a lifetime. Today, we are beginning to understand how to interrupt the progression from early adversity to disease and early death. And 30 years from now, the child who has a high ACE score and whose behavioral symptoms go unrecognized, whose asthma management is not connected, and who goes on to develop high blood pressure and early heart disease or cancer will be just as anomalous as a 6-month mortality from HIV/AIDS. People will look at that situation and say, what the heck happened there? This is treatable. This is beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look this problem in the face and say, this is real and this is all of us. I believe that we are the movement. Thank you. We make USAA for homeowners.
All right. Any thoughts on this one?
I've seen this one before actually, and then in a book I'm reading, it was also talking a lot about how ACE scores affect health outcomes. And for one, it's a good discovery in the sense that the recognition of how common different types of like very severe childhood trauma impacts physical health problems later on in life is a really important, I think, scientific and medical discovery. But then like what she talks about in the video, I think was so important, and how like the world didn't change just because people found that out. In fact, like those problems continue to happen, Muslim or not. That's just a general like issue across the world, I suppose. And I do wonder though, like if with people hear that, how much does it affect? Because you talked also about like self-fulfilling prophecy. So if kids who did those ACE tests initially, like in the time, in those, both the trials of proving that study as well as continued use of determining like what someone's ACE score is, meaning that if it's higher, you are likely to have worse health outcomes later on. And if kids know that, isn't that going to have like that self-fulfilling prophecy effect where if a kid knows they're 12 times more likely to be suicidal, like doesn't that put them more at risk to be suicidal because they know it?
Okay, that's a fair question. So this is similar to if we talk about suicide with a person who might have thought about suicide, does that mean that they're going to kill themselves?
I'll say no.
Yeah, the actual data shows that it doesn't. It actually helps them prevent it. Also, Dr. Carol Dweck, when she was presenting on the TED Talk, I believe it was 2014, 2015, something like that. I think it was 2014. So she mentioned in there that when they told people about the growth mindset, then these people actually had, they actually grew out, of the fixed mindset, and they started actually doing better. So the idea of transformation, whenever people can find a way to kind of actually solve, a problem that they're going through, when they actually realize that, when they actually sort of find somebody like a support system or whatever, then they're able to actually get out of that, and now of course they're more motivated to take steps and so on. But ultimately, when there's a lot of confusion and overwhelm, that's when people might kind of go away from this and stuff. But if they find in this context that, yeah, I am more likely, but it is treatable, it is beatable, instead of it's something that we can kind of resolve over here. When they realize that there is a way out of this misery, let's say, right, and it's not taking my own life, then they'll take that. They'll take the other step. Now, of course, if everyone leaves them, abandons them, and so on, or chastises them and stuff for whatever that's not their fault, then that's where the opposite could happen. It's important for us to recognize that just because we're going to talk about it doesn't mean that they're going to be more likely to commit suicide, or kind of give up in life. It's about how we talk about it. So there's the discussion itself, but there's also the how of the discussion. So in that aspect, talking to somebody about suicide, of course, there's a way to do it. When you are a first responder in mental health crises, then there is a way to do that, and there's a different way to do it too, which could be negative. So there's a correct way and there's a bad way. And so, with that, all that put together, it's true that a person who knows this is going to have that in their mind. But when they also know another piece of information that they can actually get better and they can get out of this, then in that case, it's different than if they didn't know that and that was the only thing that they knew and didn't have support system and so on. So in the extreme, negative situation where they don't have a support system, they're being presented this information as sort of like a put down, as opposed to saying, hey, I'm mentioning this to you just so you're aware, but we have a way to get this out, to fix this or address this. So it depends on how it's done. There's multiple different factors that come in. But if it was only one thing and it was done in a negative way and it was supposed to put the person down and so on and so on, then in that case, you would say that, yeah, this person might be more likely. But in that case, whoever did this needs to be taken out of that picture. Did that answer that question? Okay, alhamdulillah. With that in mind, how is this going? Any thoughts on this right here?
Well, I think calling it a riddle is underwhelming because it's a very big problem. I don't have an answer yet. I'm still thinking on it. But Sister Tara, if you have thoughts, I would love to hear what you have to say too.
I don't necessarily like answering these questions because I feel like there's a lot of missing information. And it's hard to just make blanket statements. But I mean, after speaking with the person initially, hearing them out and learning exactly what happened and you know, how they're feeling, then I would guess that you would want to I think sometimes when there's trauma in the past, people are still like looking for some sort of justice for that trauma. And so it leaves them with like an unfinished and like they don't have a resolution to it. And so we need to almost seal it, like, okay, this did happen. Not meaning it's any small, not making it a smaller thing at all, but to sort of like Sister Mediha was saying earlier, that she had confessed to herself the way she was feeling or how she was handling it. You know, just having those openness with yourself, agreeing that it did happen, and at this point in time, there's nothing you can change, that it did happen. So I think it's like a long process. I'm not sure that it's like a very simple answer to it.
So the question is, what could be going on and how would you proceed?
I mean, what could be going on is that they are still trying to have that resolution. So it would be good to help them try to get a perspective on it and to maybe change the way that they're looking, not the way they're looking at it, because that sounds so belittling of their experiences. But I don't know another way of saying it because I haven't spent much time actually thinking about this problem.
So helping kind of evaluate the situation a little bit more and then possibly reframing if necessary.
Right, yeah, reframing, but not belittling it in any way. But, you know, helping them go through the process of accepting that it did happen. Okay,
so for example, I had a situation where somebody asked me a question and they said, I want to know, you know, they mentioned about something between them and their mom, and how the mom had been going through certain mental health conditions or like some difficulty in that area, and it came to a point where she felt I don't know if I guess she was manipulating, or that's how it came off to the questioner, the child, and it came as if it was like, you know, really manipulative behavior and so on, and kind of always a belittling and so on. And so all this trauma eventually kind of built up, and now the person was trapped because they were trying to figure out, okay, I like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking me to do this with my parents, like be nice to them and take care of them and all that stuff, but then I have this in return, or this is how I'm being treated. I'm being manipulated, I'm being thrown under the bus and stuff, you know, all these different things and stuff that happens. So they asked, what is the Islamic ruling on this? Now, many people might jump into it and say, well, you know, they're your parents and stuff, you gotta leave, whatever. But that's not really the Islamic ruling. And I'm not the one that's saying that. There's actually a lot of discussion on this by many people especially in the last few years. And the Islamic ruling is, and one of the people mentioned this, that as the harm is increased, the rights are decreased. So it's like inverse relationship. In other words, if a person is harming you, because you're not going to be able to sustain working with them, and it's going to impact you and your functionality and stuff, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not ask you for more than what you can bear. If you're not going to be able to sustain a behavior, and it's not going to be something except after, like for a certain amount of time, and you're going to break and crack under this whole thing and stuff, right? Then obviously this is something more than you can bear. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to account you for that. Now, if we take things out of context and we take only one piece of, the Islamic framework, and we ignore everything else, then people are going to say, yes, you still have to, do this and this and this stuff, right? But it has to be important. It has to be understood over here that in situations like this, if other people know about this, they should try to get this person help, because until this person gets help, then and until we recognize it as a situation, then things are not going to, get better, and trauma and stress is going to continue to build up. And it's not something where necessarily the child, the trauma stops at childhood. It may even go on to adulthood. I know cases where adults are being treated like this, by their family members or their parents and so on, and as a consequence it just continues to build up. It hasn't stopped yet. So in this case, the person who's asking this question, one of the first things that you could do is say, okay, so let's talk about this. We can talk about what happened, why it could have happened and so on. From your perspective, you can understand where the person is coming from. It doesn't necessarily mean that you agree or disagree about anything. It's just a matter of just kind of hearing them out, hearing their perspective. There is a possibility, and I'm not saying that this is the possibility in this case or another case. I'm saying of the possibilities out there, because we don't know all the details and stuff. We weren't there with that person. We don't know the objective reality and so on. There is a possibility that part of it is something that they perceived because of their line of best fit becoming a certain way. And so that's not what really took place. But on the other hand, there's also the possibility where everything happened the way they're saying, or at least part of what they're saying happened exactly the way they're saying, right? So kind of the initial conversation you're going to have with them is just to kind of figure out what the person is feeling and so on and so on. Now, if we can potentially, in this situation, if at all possible, we can move forward where we can get in touch with the family members, or if there's a support system in a community, which in the Muslim community is very hard to get right now. So I'm just putting that out there. A lot of people are not aware of how these things work, or a lot of people are not trained in this stuff. A lot of people don't know what happens and stuff. So in the Muslim community, it's very hard to get help. In fact, not just in the Muslim community, but in the communities nowadays, mental health has always had that stigma. And I believe that it has a lot to do with how mental health was being portrayed originally, not necessarily because of how the psychologists and psychiatrists and the researchers and so on were framing it. It does have to do with partially with that, but also because of how it was being publicized by people when they were taking research studies, translating them into public language and stuff, public jargon, and then it was getting misunderstood and stuff, to the point where people actually thought if you went to a psychologist, psychiatrist, or whatever, that you were crazy, and that you were ultimately, based on the fixed mindset and understanding, that you were actually going to be like that way, and that's it, you're just a crazy person and stuff, and nobody can fix you, essentially, right? But the science and all that stuff is actually recently showing the opposite. And I mentioned, Dr. Carol Dweck and others and stuff, so just keep that in mind. So in this case, you can start off asking more questions. It could be that they have ongoing trauma. It could be, meaning like the trauma is continuing because of certain experiences, interactions and stuff. So we need to figure out if we need to cut that off, for example, or try to find ways to help kind of mitigate that. But at the same time, it could be that they stopped. So we have to figure out, differentiate between them. That's one of the things I would look at, right? That's one of the first things I would, in terms of how I would proceed, that's one of the things I would do. Try to figure out what is the source, kind of understand what's going on and stuff like that. Try to see if there's any support system in the family. Try to see if they have, like somebody that they can connect to, for example, like a mental health professional, or somebody else, somebody that they can trust and so on. What are some things that you would do in those situations? Like when it comes to how would you connect that person? Well, there are people, Muslim health professionals that are there that you can connect with. Obviously, many of them specialize in different things, and so they may or may not be working in a team. Recently, there has been some development in terms of, in our area, where there are, collaborations that are starting to form. It wasn't like this some years back, and I don't know if it's, you know, in like how many other communities have something like this going on. There are definitely communities that have better like teams and structures, but it's not in every community. And also it's not necessarily public, and a lot of this also might be in its early phases and stuff. So there is that kind of like, you know, deficiency that needs to be addressed. Now in the meantime, if assuming that we have a mental health professional, a Muslim one or not, that we can connect to, then we should be very clear in terms of the expectations for that person. We like a lot of, you know, in the mental health community, the causes of depression are not confirmed yet. A lot of these things are not necessarily confirmed yet. They know the symptoms of what happens, and they try to find treatments for them, but the cure ultimately is still being assessed, essentially, or they're still trying to figure that out, because we don't necessarily know like causes from a scientific perspective. From other perspectives, if you want to look at Islamic perspective instead, we have a better idea, but that doesn't mean anything, you know, in this context. So just keep that in mind, inshallah. So these are some things that I would start off with. We talked about mindfulness also. Mindfulness could be also very useful in this case. Just understanding, kind of like being in the moment, not letting your past haunt you, not thinking that somebody else defines who you are just because you're saying something about you. That's important. Just because somebody says you're a bad person and stuff, or you're selfish or whatever and stuff, doesn't actually mean that you are those things, unless you are doing things that are, you know, that are objectively like that from, you know, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's perspective. But even in that case, being selfish is not necessarily a bad thing. There's good selfish and there's a bad selfish. Selfish where you want to protect your own mental health and wellness and so on. In that case, it's a good thing, right? Because you want to make sure that you can continue doing the things that you need to do, that you're responsible for, and so on, and that you're not going to get debilitated. Then in that case, that's a good thing. So in that case, you need to have boundaries. You can even set boundaries with parents if there's any kind of toxic relationship and stuff that's going on, if that's feasible. But of course, you know, I'm giving general things, and I'm not prescribing specific things for specific individuals and so on. So people shouldn't just take that just because I said it and apply it in their specific context. But there are boundaries that, you know, we should establish, and there's nothing wrong with establishing boundaries where those boundaries are necessary and important, you know, for our functioning and so on. Now, of course, what those boundaries look like can be discussed more in depth and so on, and that would be a one-on-one conversation between somebody that's, you know, that they can have these conversations, not just anybody, but just somebody who knows background in deen and also mental health and, you know, a few other things. That person could actually you can have that conversation with them. But ultimately, I hope this kind of gave you just something to think about. And I do have some more things that I want to share before we kind of, you know, go deeper into, or we go further into discussing this right here. But remember this, and next time, inshallah, we'll kind of expand on this a little bit more too, and some more things that you can kind of look at to kind of get a better idea how to navigate the situation, inshallah, what could be going on, how to proceed, and so on. Okay, so if there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and close, inshallah. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close, and I'll stop the recording. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.